Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm your host, Keith Downey, and I am incredibly excited to introduce our next guest, who has more than 30 years of journalism and communications experience as Director of Communications for EWTN, as Editor-in-Chief for the Catholic Standard and Times in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and as her editor/reporter for several national publications. The list goes on, including one that we're going to be talking about, 3 Catholic Media Awards for walking the way of the cross for caregivers. Whew, that's a mouthful. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning, Keith. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so, the topic that we've had throughout the entire show just so happens to fall in line with the book you wrote, Walking the Way of the Cross for Caregivers. Dealing with, within the show, we were dealing with throwaway culture in relation to humanity from birth to natural death. So when it comes to caregiving, especially when it comes to your book that you wrote, tell us a little bit about the book. How is this book, I guess, different from other caregiving books, and why'd you write it?
Well, I wrote it because my husband suffered 3 bouts of cancer over 8 years. He had his leg amputated up to the hip, and he became a quadriplegic. And during that time, I was working a full-time job. I was his sole caregiver until the very end, when I couldn't lift him and I had to call in some help. But there was so much I didn't know. And I wrote the book because I wanted to help people like me who, this came out of the blue, this diagnosis. And, I also, a few years later, faced the death of my sister from cancer. My mom died of dementia, and all of those situations were different. So I've had a lot of experience with death. And I thought, this is the book I wish that I had had. The whole Walking the Way of the Cross came about because I was standing in church during one Lent, and we were going through the Stations of the Cross. And this was years later, after my husband had died. And all of a sudden, all of those scenes from our life of caregiving started just passing before my eyes as we were going through the various stations. And I just realized, my Lord, we really were walking the way of the cross. It's not what I thought of when we were doing it, but in retrospect, I realized it's exactly what it was. And so I really felt like it was a calling from God to write this book.
Wow. And thank you for writing this book, because I know there are many people, especially my age now, as a millennial, who are starting to go through some of these with our grandparents and even our parents. So it's especially nice to have some sort of something to look at and to read and to get advice from. So thank you. I guess a question for you: how did we get here? Because I believe there's been some throwaway culture over the course of history when it comes to the elderly, but why do you think it's so incredibly prevalent today, where there's so many elderly in all of these facilities with no one to care for? Like, how did we get here?
I think it's such a very selfish me culture. And what people don't really understand is that when you live that way, you're going to have so many regrets on the other side. You've got, and I talk about this in the book. I say there are 2 audiences. One is the obvious one, people that are either caregivers now or know they soon will be. But the other audience is the right to die crowd. And I wanted to show people, you have Brittany Maynard. I don't know if you all remember her. She's the one that she was diagnosed with what they said was be a fatal illness. And so she went famously to Oregon in order to commit suicide. Her family took her there. And, I wanted to show in this book what death with dignity really looks like. And it's not killing yourself. I could really say after the death of my husband, because we didn't get the miracle, but I did not have any regrets. And there's just so much to be said. There's so many ways that our love grew through what we went through. The good times were not over. It was a hard time, but when I look back on it, it was one of the most blessed times of my life. And that's what people are going to miss. They're going to miss what God has for them, because this life is over in a blink. What matters is eternity. And if you just living for yourself, Lord knows what's going to happen on the other side.
You're telling me, yeah. There's so many people my age that are living for themselves. You know, they're getting married and then they're just not having kids for whatever reason. Maybe it's the selfish tendencies. I can't assume what they're doing, but that's going to be an issue. I can see it like in 30, 40 years when they have nobody to take care of them, and it's going to be even worse then. Wow. So you're the director of communications for EWTN. How do you see your role in spreading awareness about caregiving issues and offering support to caregivers aside from your book?
Well, I have a lot of opportunities. For example, we've got a newsletter called Wings that goes out every week. And I get a chance to preview a lot of our shows and then to write features about, okay, this is one of the best shows you're going to see this week. And I always, when there is something that has to do with caregiving or helping, in some way your elderly relative. And by the way, caregiving isn't just for the elderly. I mean, there are young people that are diagnosed with cancer and various other illnesses. And I think that I bring that perspective because I pull it out. You know what I mean? And you only can talk about certain highlights when you're doing that, but those are the ones that I always go for. So it's a meaningful job. And I also am in charge of our main social media sites, and so a lot of the things that we choose to put on there have to do with that. So there's many opportunities that I have because I work for EWTN. But I will say this: anybody has opportunities like that, even when you're in the secular world. And I want to encourage people. A lot of times we think people won't listen if we say that. They'll think we're over the top. But I found that people are amazingly receptive. There's a lot of suffering out there people don't talk about. And when they see that you're somebody that's open to that, you'd be amazed at the conversations you could have and how deep they can be instead of that surface kind of conversation.
So true. Huh. So I guess because we have a few minutes left, can you share maybe a moment you've had with someone, whether they've read your book or not, that kind of reaffirmed your message? You're like, yeah, this is what I absolutely needed to do, and the importance of your mission.
Well, I've had the opportunity to speak around the country now about the book. And I had an experience during a Q&A where a woman raised her hand and after my talk, and she said, "I don't have a question, Michelle." She said, "But I want you to know that my husband is getting increasingly ill, and I know that shortly I'm going to have to become his caregiver." And she said, "I've been so afraid." And she said, "But after listening to your talk, I realize I don't have to be, because God will be with me." And that is the key message of the book, because I could not have done anything I did. People say, "Oh, it's so wonderful that you did that." No, it's not so wonderful that I did it. Anything I did that was good was God, because I was terrified in the beginning, terrified. I did not know if I could do it. I only knew I loved my husband and I wanted to be there for him. But, I remember standing outside of his room one time and, his leg was filled with cancer and it was leaking and smelly and awful. And I didn't want to go in there and wrap it like I had to. But I looked up to heaven and just this prayer was given me, because it's not how I normally pray. And it was, "Divine physician, help me." And immediately I got the grace. And I walked in, I was like, come on, honey, let's do this. And he was like, I'm so sorry I have to put you through this. And I said, it's okay. And in that moment, it was because God had given me the grace. And that is the kind of thing I want people to know. You're not alone. God is there.
Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. I know there's people out there listening who are going through something similar, taking care of, like you said, a child maybe with cancer or someone in their family that's elderly, that it's hard. And maybe you don't want to do it because of the situation and it's tough. You know, you're working a full-time job. But thankfully, we have you, Michelle, as someone who's given us an example by writing this book, Walking the Way of the Cross for Caregivers, how to cope practically, emotionally, and spiritually when a loved one has a serious illness. Incredible book. Is there any other place aside from, catching your work on EWTN? I know you mentioned, was it Wings, a newsletter, but that's probably internally. But is there any other place we can catch you?
Yes, well, I have a website called caregiversofthecross.com. And there you can see other interviews I've done. You can get a free chapter of the book if you're interested. The good times are not over, and it's about our trip to a dude ranch when my husband was really sick. It's got resources. You can get the book from EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com, from Amazon, really anywhere that, books are sold. I hope you'll join us on Facebook. There's also a Caregivers of the Cross Facebook group. So all of those are ways. And my email is catholiceditor@protonmail.com.
Wonderful. You have, given us so many resources beyond the book. Thank you again. And if you're available, please join us in the after show clubhouse. And thank you once again, Michelle Laque Johnson, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Keith.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, listeners out there, if you are going to stay tuned for Mass coming up next, please pray for us. Keep us in your prayers. Otherwise, if maybe you're jumping into the office and you're thinking, I can't listen to the after show, you can just discreetly pull up the YouTube page, GRN Online, and you'll be able to watch the after show clubhouse. You're invited. It's exclusive, but just for you. Anyways, if I don't see you until tomorrow, have a blessed day and make it joyful.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.